Hi everyone, I'm John Williamson. I hope you had a good first session. And I'm here to tell you about my dissertation, which I wrote as a hard-boiled detective novel about the quasi-psychological educational category of students labeled slow learners. So it was in education research curriculum that the dissertation was done in, although I just used the passive voice there, and I don't know why I did because it didn't feel very passive when I was doing it. In the Journal of Applied Hermeneutics, where sort of inspired by some of the Victorian novels and Charles Dickens, Nancy Moles, the editor of the journal, has been releasing this dissertation in like serial releases, and so we're almost done. I'm just editing part 5 right now, taking out some of the slightly more boring parts that I no longer need because it's no longer a dissertation, and just having all the really hard pedagogic action in there. And so you can read parts 1 to 4 now. Part 5 will be coming out like really soon, within the next couple of weeks. And I would actually encourage you to seek out the dissertation in that form as opposed to its original form. They're pretty close. But like I said, the journal version just is a little bit faster. I only use like one example of many of the truth claims as opposed to like, 4 examples when I really had to prove that I knew what I was talking about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to tell you why I chose to write a detective novel. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the challenges that I faced. If you have a question that you're just dying to ask, feel free to interrupt me. I'm a high school teacher. I'm used to that. Okay, so I went a little bit long last time, and I don't want anybody to leave with a burning curiosity that's unanswered, if that's okay. Next slide, please. So that's me in the 1970s. I grew up in Westlock, Alberta. Next slide. That is my first book. It is a comic book I wrote about being chased by the police in the small town of Westlock, Alberta, getting caught, getting sent to a dungeon, and then escaping from the police on a BMX bike with my friend. And they put it, the school where I was going thought it was funny, I guess. I don't think it's very appropriate looking back, but, and they put it like in the Westlock St. Mary elementary school public library, and I was like, hey, I'm an author. And then, I kind of always felt like I was an author after that. However, my educational journey through school was not a smooth one because I have a learning disability, or at least I had what they called the 1970s, 80s version of learning disabilities. So the manifestation in my case was a lot of clumsiness, which I still sort of have. If you don't get anything else out of this talk, you're going to get a lot of entertaining gesticulating. And it also involved, like I couldn't count properly, as in, it seems like all of the elementary school curriculum, and I'm probably exaggerating, but it seemed like all of it was like counting how many dots were on the ladybug's wings, okay? Which is a little bit of a problem if you don't remember which dots you've already counted, which I was constantly not remembering. So it had nothing to do with my visual, like 20/20, that kind of thing. It was more like I just couldn't keep track. And it also brutally affected my handwriting, even though I was a really good writer. And so I already sort of got some feelings in school that I wasn't someone who belonged as a result of those experiences. However, I did manage to barely escape the Alberta education K-12 system, and then barely get into Red Deer College, where I discovered I actually had some ability. So I did an English degree, history degree, Bachelor of Education after degree. I didn't really think of myself as like disabled because that wasn't a word people really used when I was going to school. So I certainly didn't try to direct my teaching experiences towards that, except I got surplused because I was the newest teacher at a school from being an English teacher into a program that was called the Integrated Occupation Program, then called the Knowledge and Employability Series of Classes, specifically designed for students with the unofficial educational categorization of slow learner. basically a slow learning student, according to this category that I no longer really believe strongly in, is a student with academic failure and a low average IQ, okay? So it's like our 70 to 89 type of IQ combined with not doing very well in school. That is the program, or that is the student that this series of classes that I was teaching was intended for. And I found I actually really liked teaching knowledge and employability classes, or IOP as they used to be called. I experienced the students as quite competent despite whatever was said about them. I found we had a lot in common because even though we had different learning issues, we had learning issues, and so we had that feeling of not belonging in schools. And so it was a place that I really, found myself, even though I didn't ask to go there, I wanted to stay there as a form of teaching. This is our son Jacob. He was our second born, beautiful kid, very loving, happy. Some interesting things about Jacob. He couldn't walk when he was 3, but if my daughter walked into the room, he'd follow her so keenly with his eyes, it was almost like he was flying, like he'd skip walking altogether. Another cool thing about Jacob was whenever we knocked anything over, a lot of babies, and he was still kind of like a baby, and even 3 and 4. A lot of babies will cry with loud noises, but he just thought they were hilarious. So anytime something fell over in the kitchen or whatever, he would just break out in uproarious laughter. So that was pretty endearing. And I knocked things over a lot, so I was maybe a great entertainer. Jacob passed away in 2005, and it was a privilege having him in our family for as long as we did. And it really showed me a lot more about the complexity of difference. It showed me how difficult it can be a parent of a child with a disability, not because of the child, but because of the bureaucratic procedure that's involved in getting all the services that you require. So I'm if my wife and I were not highly educated and really good at filling out paperwork, where would we be, right? I also realized that there's huge differences in how people interpret difference. So some of the most inclusive people were my parents-in-laws, who were both farmers that just really seemed to get it. And he was just a part of the family, Curiously, however, when Jacob was born, I did have somebody tell me they were sorry. When he passed away, I did have somebody tell me it was for the best, and both of those people were teachers. So again, my mind is just reeling with all of these ideas about how people take up and interpret difference. I then moved on to become a diverse learning coordinating teacher. So I was still working with slow learning students, but I was now also working with all of the students in the school that had any kind of label. I was in charge of all of the site-based services for basically a student who was an English language learner, learning disability label, still the slow learning students, the way they organize things at my school, gifted, basically everything. And I've been doing that, I still do that now, so I've been doing that since 2005. Some things I started to figure out as a result of all of this is, it's like Ian Hacking said, and I'm not saying there isn't some neurobiological basis to impairment, but also we tend to make people up around their impairments. And so these are all things that I discovered was in the literature about slow learners and who they are, their ontology as students, based on having an IQ of 75 or 80, okay? Next slide, please. Thank you so much. I've worried that I'm sounding bossy but so there's no other way.
You want me to press the button? You have to tell me.
Yeah, I know. Sometimes it's unavoidable. This is more like what I discovered. incredible complexity behind every single student with this label, okay? There are so many ways to become a slow learner, be they socioeconomic, behavior, could be sexuality or gender identity. We had one student that we couldn't figure out exactly why he was being referred to our program. He wasn't the most hardworking student, but he wasn't really struggling either, except that it was a small program with a limited amount of students, a little bit cut off from like the other larger high school classes, and it was like 15 years ago, or 10 to 15 years ago, and he was self-identified as gay, and he was quite flamboyant. And I think they really just thought that this would be a place that would be more comfortable for this student, as well as his teachers and classmates, to put him in the slow learner program. And there's all kinds of stories like that. That's what we're constantly experiencing, is that these programs just become a place to put people who don't fit, right? Next slide, please. And so by now I have what I would consider a head full of hornets about all of this. And so I decide to do a PhD, basically just to make sense of all of this. My supervisor, Dr. Jim Field, who I'd highly recommend as a supervisor for anyone who's in education, was somebody that had been on my supervisory committee when I did my MA. I also knew him as an undergraduate when I did my B.Ed after. And so I called him up and I said I was interested in investigating the category of slow learner, and then he was like, I sort of had to talk him into it a little bit, but then he was on board. And so we went ahead, and but I didn't want to just investigate it like clinically, because as far as I could tell, most of the clinical investigation about slow learners had not been helpful. So I wanted to explode it in all of its complexity. And not only the complexity of students with this particular label in this particular program, that is really underfunded in Alberta, that has a really poor graduation rate compared to the amount of students that would be labeled slow learners, and which orders a credential, or which offers a credential for students that stay in IOP or K&E that do not graduate with a high school diploma. It's called an IOP or K&E certificate that only 1% of Alberta students earn, and it basically is no better than dropping out of high school in terms of what it will get you in terms of post-secondary, okay? Also, I sort of came to understand that the larger special education system was a bit of a mess also. So there was this huge reform effort called Setting the Direction that then became this policy called Action on Inclusion, and this was in the early 2000s. At some point, Action on Inclusion made one significant change with the funding model of how students with disabilities are funded. Now, every student in Alberta, there's some diverse learning funding attached to every single Alberta student, whether they have a disability or not, as opposed to like $15,000 for a student with a severe mental health disability. So that may have actually been a positive change. However, that was the only change. Nothing has changed about Alberta's coding system, about their accommodations policies. Basically, there's been no major change in inclusive education, special education, since the very beginning of the massive Setting the Direction reform from a long time ago. That's all still underway. And at one point, my friend Chris Gillum and I were doing some research. We wrote a paper about this. And we discovered that over a very short period of time, the Action on Inclusion website was this rich repository of resources and policies that were moving forward. And then one day it just said Action on Inclusion no longer exists as an initiative. So this massive special education reform, as far as any practitioner in Alberta could tell, just basically stalled, okay? So what I wanted to do with all of this is I wanted to explore it in its incredible complexity, okay? I learned in a university course on detective fiction that I took because I already liked detective fiction and I wanted to learn more about it, that there's a bunch of different kind of mysteries. One kind of mystery is Golden Age, That's like the Sherlock Holmes one, where you have an upper-class amateur detective that solves crimes in the sterile environment of mostly his own sitting room, just by thinking really hard about them. Then he goes and tells the answer to the cops who are too dumb to know the answer because they're working class, they're not amateurs, so if they have to do it for a living, they're probably not very good at it. Tends to be somewhat conservative. The crime restores the just minor blip on the social order, or the solution of the crime restores the minor blip on the social order that the crime created, and then everything just goes back to normal because we're dealing with a very stable social order. Hard-boiled, completely different, okay? Sometimes hard-boiled detectives don't even get around to solving the mystery. It's more about the atmosphere, the attitude, the environment, and the job, okay? It's about having a case that works on you as much as you work on the case, which is kind of like being an educator. And it's actually kind of like working with clients in any sort of educational, therapeutic, or social endeavor. Now, if you're going to do this kind of thing, you have to prove that you know what you're talking about, okay? One of my other committee members, Dr. Jim Paul, put it pretty memorably when he said, you can't just look like you're screwing around with a detective novel. So I read, studied, interviewed everything I possibly could. I interviewed teachers, I interviewed students, I interviewed curriculum leaders. I studied disability history going back forever ago, and I put it all in a disability history museum that the protagonist wanders through. I watched the movies, which wasn't that painful. I read everything about Alberta education had ever said about slow learners, about vocational programming going back 100 years, and all the psychological data on these students in general that I could get my hands on. And some of that stuff was pretty painful to read. And it went over pretty well. I didn't just like barely get away with it, which I kind of thought was how it might go. 4 out of 5 of my committee members loved it. The one committee member who did not love it still really liked it. He had a really good question, which is a good question for anybody that takes on an aesthetic form of research. He was very honest, and I might be over-characterizing it, but he basically said, I find this genre of writing alienating. It's macho and homophobic and sexist and violent, and like why? I just find it really hard to embrace an educational mystery set in with this protagonist, because it's not me. Like I'm the client who hires this macho detective named Max Hunter to go and find the category of slow learners. So, and that was a fair criticism. Now, to his credit, he stuck with it. He really respected the research, and towards the end of the piece, he was getting into it a little bit more. So, and I think it was a very fair and valid criticism of the work. However, 4 out of 5. I want to say dentists for some reason. 4 out of 5 people, committee members, really liked it. As I mentioned, it's come out in the Journal of Applied Hermeneutics. It won the Chancellor's Medal in 2015. It amuses me that with the breadth and depth of academia in these days, that the Governor General's Medal went to someone who, as I understand it, made it so satellites could have antennas that talk to each other more autonomously. And then they announced me at the luncheon, and it's like, and John wrote a detective novel. So it was amusing, and also affirming, actually. I don't know, teachers, when they read it, are really enjoying it. I have a lot of writer friends. I do slam poetry and things like that, and a lot of my friends that are in the writing community in general are enjoying it. Academics beyond my immediate committee have been enjoying it too since it came out. So basically, now I know a lot of these people, so if they didn't like it, they probably wouldn't tell me. But it's been fairly well received, is I guess what I'm trying to say, ever since it came out. And I think it's probably going to continue to be well received in really exposing and addressing the complexity with which we understand difference in schools through the lens of slow learner, but also as it applies to everything that appears on the scene as an educational difference to us. I forget what's on the next slide. Oh, yeah, challenges. It took forever. It took me 5 years. I was teaching full-time at the time, but I got up an hour and a half earlier than I would have otherwise, and I just wrote every morning. I figured, if I was going to use all of my energy, I should do that right away because I'd be too tired after school. It's really long, which was a problem in attracting supervisory committee members. No one wants to read a 500-page dissertation. Until we found somebody that did. Professor Nick Hodge from England, a disability studies scholar who took on the challenge and loved it, and actually wrote an editorial introducing part 2 of the serialization. And he's just a great writer about autism and other differences. But yeah, it was a challenge. We asked several people until Nick finally said yes. I'd have to find solutions for things. Like, I spent I hope the government wasn't watching me because I spent like a week just researching guns on YouTube because I didn't know anything about guns. There's another, one of my characters gets thrown into a giant shredder machine because, bureaucracy, paper shredder. And I spend like a couple of days just looking at how big they actually make shredders on YouTube. That's really big. You can shred a car. Did you know that? But, so it's like I'd have to find all these fictive solutions that you don't have to find in a regular dissertation because, you don't have to say, I showed up for the interview. It was a cold and stormy, night or anything. You're there at the interview, right? Formatting wasn't actually a huge problem. We thought it would be, but it wasn't. Basically, my committee the university accepted almost everything, so it was great that way. I found a very accepting audience, probably because Jim was a great advocate, and then also because the work was perceived as of quality. I worried a lot about how this would go, and so this is all part of taking on an innovative dissertation. A lot of this is about taking on any dissertation, I think, anyways. But I think you have a greater uncertainty when you try to be outside of the box a little bit. So I kind of the character of Max Hunter I voice in kind of a Clint Eastwood accent. It was a messy case. They can all get messy, but this one got under my skin. I never should have agreed to it the day I got the call. Maybe I hadn't had enough Java that day, and my sense of danger was already in glorious repose. I was, to be sure, already tired as I squeaked open the office door of my office, already tired as I slouched into the desk. I hadn't had any business in a week, but I was still luxuriating in the rewards from that last case, a bruised jaw, a torn rotator cuff, a fractured love life, and a slight dimming of my already flickering pilot light of hope. I'd been paid out all right, in everything but fees, and even as I pondered the toll the last case had taken on me, I knew I would need a paying job soon. The rent for the office was due, and the dust bunnies in my care needed to be provided for in the style they'd grown accustomed to. I was torn between brewing a pot of Java or treating myself to a drink from the office bottle at the bottom drawer of my desk. I just sat there staring at the wall, waiting to see which impulse prevailed. I was watching some ants skittering up the wall like they were racing towards some kind of bounty, which I discovered private detectives spend a lot of times watching bugs climb walls, so I wanted to put that in there. It might have been a speck of sugar from the day the week before when I threw my mug of Java against it. The one to bring it back to the queen would win a knighthood. Above them, a spider cruised along her web. They were racing toward her too. They were just too busy to notice. I didn't have the heart to tell them. The unfolding drama was interrupted by the ringing of my phone. I picked it up and was about to announce myself when the voice on the other end beat me to it. "Is this Max Hunter?" I considered asking if he was a tax collector or a jealous husband, but he sounded worried, and I didn't think a crack like that was necessarily appropriate. I answered to the affirmative. It's John Williamson. I'm calling from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I'm a teacher. I teach special education. Actually, I sort of coordinate special education at my school. Some of my students, the slow learners, they've all disappeared. And it's not just here, it's all across the province. So call the police. I've heard the Mounties always get their man. I can't. They don't handle cases where metaphysics are involved. I had no idea what he was talking about, but he sounded firm on the point. I switched gears. Why me? Sorry, voices. I was told you were hard-boiled. He'd done some research. This impressed me slightly. Can you afford me? Well, your usual rates are kind of steep for my department budget, but I need a professional on the case, and I have some money left. You'd have to save every receipt for expenses and, I'm sorry to say this, pay for your own drinks. I'm willing to meet to hear more, but no promises. At least it would get me out of the office and away from that bottom drawer. Thank you, Mr. Hunter. That's all I ask. I'll meet you at my school next Tuesday during the first morning tutorial at 7:56 a.m. And make sure you park in visitor, not teacher parking. And make sure you sign the book with your license plate number, make and model of car, and the staff member you are visiting, and the time of arrival. And be sure to collect a visitor's badge. Can someone frisk me too? I asked, mocking the formality of the proposed liaison, but candidly relieved by the prospect of employment, despite my insouciant reply.